being a war hero, fighting for your country, only to be treated like garbage in a courtroom. This is exactly what happened to Steve, a veteran who was about to lose everything. Until something shocking happened. Steve Thompson, a 45-year-old war veteran from a small town in Ohio, was no stranger to struggle. He had served in the Iraq War, facing brutal conditions and enduring injuries that stayed with him long after he left the battlefield. Despite all he had sacrificed, Steve found himself fighting another battle, one that wasn't fought with guns or in the sand, but in a courtroom. After years of trying to get his veteran benefits, Steve thought the process would finally be over. But he couldn't have been more wrong. On that fateful day, Steve walked into the courthouse with hope, determined to finally get the help he deserved. He had all his documents in order, proof of his injuries, and a story to tell. But the moment he stepped into that courtroom, the reality of how badly he had been underestimated hit him. The judge, a white man who looked far too disinterested in Steve's case, barely glanced at him before dismissing the whole thing. Steve could hardly believe what he was hearing. The judge's tone was dismissive, as if Steve's entire service to the country didn't matter. To make matters worse, Steve wasn't the only veteran treated this way. As he looked around the courtroom, he realized this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a system designed to fail him and countless others like him. Veterans, who had given up so much for their country, were getting pushed aside like their sacrifices meant nothing. It wasn't just about Steve anymore. It was about a deeply ingrained problem where people who deserved the most respect were getting the least. Steve was angry, but more than that, he was determined. He knew something had to change. What he didn't know was that this courtroom battle would push him to do the unthinkable, to fight back in a way no one expected. As Steve stood there, hearing the judge dismiss his case, a deep anger began to build inside him. He had been through hell for his country, sacrificing years of his life, enduring physical and mental scars that never fully healed. Yet here he was, treated like a criminal for simply asking for what was rightfully his. The courtrooms had already been tough, but this moment felt like the breaking point. The judge's eyes were cold, uninterested in the years Steve had given to serve, and even less concerned with the countless others in the same situation. Steve had faced this kind of discrimination before. As a black veteran in a predominantly white community, he had long been aware of the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, prejudices that marked his life. But in this moment, it wasn't just about race, it was about a system that seemed designed to make people like him invisible. The judge had already decided Steve's case was not worth hearing. But Steve wasn't about to give up. For months, he'd been studying law on his own. He knew the process wasn't easy, and he knew the challenges faced by veterans like him. He'd read up on past cases, loopholes in the law, and how others had fought back in the face of injustice. His mind raced as the judge continued speaking, but Steve's focus sharpened. He knew the key to winning wasn't going to be begging for mercy or sharing his personal story for the 100th time. It would be about taking control of the legal process that was stacked against him. Steve had no formal legal education, but his research had prepared him for this moment. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a man armed with knowledge and determination. As the judge gave his final word, Steve did something unexpected. Without saying a word, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thick legal textbook. The courtroom fell silent. People stared, unsure of what was about to happen. Steve, calm but resolute, started flipping through the pages, finding the right sections, the right laws, the right loopholes. It wasn't just about having the documents, it was about understanding them. And Steve understood. What followed was a string of legal references and citations that shocked everyone in the room, including the judge. It was a moment of pure determination. Steve had turned the tables, using the very laws that had been used against him to show the courtroom how wrong they were. The judge, still sitting at his bench with a look of disbelief, scoffed at Steve as he flipped through the legal book. You think quoting some law books is going to change anything? The judge asked, clearly unimpressed. Steve, however, didn't flinch. He continued to flip the pages with quiet confidence, the noise of the pages turning echoing in the still courtroom. Steve had learned everything he needed to know by studying law during his off time, poring over case studies and legal loopholes that applied specifically to veterans' benefits. He knew the law better than most attorneys in the room, and now, in front of this judge, he was about to prove it. He found the section he had been looking for, a specific clause that had been overlooked by nearly every lawyer and judge who had previously handled his case. The judge raised an eyebrow, still not believing what he was seeing. "This is a waste of time," he muttered, but Steve didn't hesitate. He pointed to the exact statute and read it aloud, explaining how the law required veterans' benefits to be processed in a very specific way, something that the court had completely ignored. His voice was steady but firm, with a clear understanding of every word he was speaking. The courtroom, filled with onlookers, went silent. For the first time, the judge actually stopped to listen. Steve wasn't just some angry man in a courtroom anymore. He was a man who knew his rights, and he wasn't going to back down. With every sentence Steve spoke, the judge's expression changed, shifting from one of arrogance to one of uncertainty. The moment was palpable. Steve wasn't just defending himself. He was dismantling a system that had tried to push him aside. As Steve wrapped up his argument, the judge sat back in his chair, clearly stunned by the force of Steve's knowledge. It was a pivotal moment, not just for Steve, but for everyone in that courtroom. The judge had underestimated Steve, and now he had no choice but to reconsider his decision. Steve had proven that knowledge, not just courage, was the ultimate weapon in a world that often tries to silence those who dare to fight back. The case wasn't over yet, but Steve had already won the first victory. If you think this is a story that needs to be heard, don't forget to hit subscribe and stay tuned for more stories like this.